On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, some tough questions coming for vendors that sell to the Pentagon.
If you're doing assessments, how many have been successful and how many have been unsuccessful? And have you ever had a successful assessment come back and where the government said you did it wrong?
CMMC expert Eric Crucius on Fed Gov Today in just a moment. First, though, the Army says its transformation in contact models changing the way it develops and fields electromagnetic warfare capabilities. You'll meet two Army leaders that are pushing the service's progress on modernization for electronic warfare on the next Fed Gov Today TV. You can watch the debut on ABC7 in Washington and on the Fed Gov Today YouTube channel at 10:30 Sunday morning. If you missed the debut, you can watch anytime at fedgovtoday.com and on YouTube. Vendors that sell to the Defense Department have 2 months to prepare for cybersecurity requirements and contracts. The final rule of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification is out. Eric Crucius is Government Contracts Practice Chair at Hunton Andrews Kurth. Eric, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. You and I have been talking about CMMC since the beginning of CMMC. It's finally here. It must feel for you like the culmination of years of practice and work in anticipation of this. Welcome, my friend.
Thanks. Great to be here. And yes, I still remember from the Government Matters days coming on and talking about a proposed rule that might come about CMMC. And boy, it's come a long way. And it's taken a while, and there were a lot of naysayers out there, but it's finally here and it's real.
The department is planning to implement the program's 3-tier model in 4 phases over the course of the next 3 years, I read in National Defense, the publication of NDIA. What's the timeline look like to you? Who's expected to do what between now and when, Eric?
Sure. So this rule that came out yesterday will be effective essentially November 10th. So that means starting November 10th, solicitations will have the CMMC requirement in it. And the interesting thing about that is in the final rule, they also said they're going to have the program office determine which contracts initially for the first 3 years will have CMMC in it. We don't know which one of those contracts will be the contracts that have CMMC in it. So I understand kind of their thinking. You want to have more of a gentle ramp up because there are only so many assessors out there, and there are over 100,000 companies that will need an assessment eventually. But if companies don't know which company or which contract is going to have an assessment, then if I own a business in the Defense Department space, I'm going to go out and get assessed because I don't know if that solicitation that's coming out next week is going to require CMMC. So it'll be interesting to see if they actually decide ahead of time which programs are going to have CMMC. Like for 1.0, they talked about a Pathfinder program and they identified contracts. Everything I've heard is that they're not going to do that this time. But if they do that, that may prevent a little bit of a run on the bank with the C3PAOs out there doing the assessments.
What does the timeline look like broadly in the assessment community? What's your sense of whether there are enough assessors, whether the ramp up will be sufficient to meet the demands? It's one thing, as you just said, to analyze what we think the department is going to do. It's another thing to analyze what we think could actually happen based on the actions that the department's taking.
Right. And that's a great question because, they announced with the programmatic rule, this kind of phase out program where they talk about phase 1 just being a self-assessment required for the first year. So from November 10th of this year till November 10th of 2026, it'll just be a self-assessment that's required. That being said, the department has the right to kind of fast forward a little bit and move up that requirement to require third-party assessments earlier. But the default will be at least for only self-assessments the first year. Because there are a limited number of assessors out there. The C3POs, which are the organizations capable of doing the assessments, there are less than 100. Some of them have multiple assessment teams, but some of them are not really actively doing assessments either. So there's probably about 100 teams out there doing assessments right now. And by DOD's own estimate, there are 100,000 companies that will need an assessment. So it's one assessor team for every 1,000 companies that need an assessment. There needs to be some breathing time in order for assessors to be able to get out there and reach a number of companies, at least a critical mass, so that when this thing really launches, there's enough companies that have assessments done in order to support the department and its mission.
Do you worry that there is going to be this assessment boom, that this becomes a situation where folks are jumping into the assessment business that may or may not be qualified to do assessments?
I think we're going to see some of that. There are standards in place and training requirements and things like that to protect the ecosystem from that. But inevitably, like with any profession, there's going to be folks that have higher standards than others. And if an assessor is out there not meeting the standards that the department expects, I imagine that will be found out at some point, but it may be after a bunch of assessments are done. So my hope is that kind of the standards they have in place that are detailed in the programmatic rule that came out last December, coupled with kind of the training that they have to have and the tests they have to pass, that will ensure that they have the sufficient training to do the assessments the right way. But there's always, your observation spot on with anything like this, is always a risk that you'll have some bad apples out there or uneducated apples.
Yeah, I'm less worried about the bad apples than I am about the people who are just not quite sure what they're doing. Is
right.
What it strikes me as is potentially an unintended consequence here.
Right, and you do see a lot of that. You see posts on LinkedIn saying, "I got my first CMMC client. What should I do?" And they're consultants trying to help folks kind of figure out how to be compliant with the underlying security controls. And you never want it to be the first time for somebody when you're getting something like that done.
Yeah.
There always has to be a first. Like I had a first case, right, or a first government contracts protest, and so there's always going to be a first. But you don't want it to be you that's going through that first for that person. So there's a lot of that going on, and a lot of this stuff is unregulated, right? I can offer consulting services tomorrow and be completely uneducated about CMMC and the underlying security controls, and try to sell those services. As long as I don't hold myself out as being certified by somebody, there's nothing technically unlawful about that, although you may get yourself sued if you don't fulfill your obligation on the contract. But it's really, I always tell folks who are looking for services in this space, ask the pointed question, how many of X have you done before? And if you're doing assessments, how many have been successful and how many have been unsuccessful? And have you ever had a successful assessment come back and where the government said you did it wrong? So all those kinds of questions I think are really important to ask. So when you go into this process, which is expensive on its own, you don't want to pay for it twice. Asking those questions can really save a lot of time and money and heartache, and maybe contracts if the assessment is faulty.
From the department's perspective, what would you expect them to do to look at this timeline as it rolls out and determine that it worked the way that they wanted it to? Is it just a matter of they get enough vendors to bid on these solicitations that are qualified that have certifications, or is there more to it than that, do you think?
I think it's really that. I think it's having enough vendors, and is my supply chain really, for those vendors, like those large prime contractors, their extensive supply chains, are they able to pull those supply chains along and make sure that they get assessed as well or have the right assessments? There are creative solutions also, because you don't necessarily have to flow down the information that would trigger an assessment. So it's very possible that that these large primes are going to kind of house the information themselves and allow vendors to view it, to avoid kind of technically sending it to those vendors. But as long as I think the department, as long as they have enough bidders, they're going to be fine. They're going to hear it from people, but I think they won't care as long as they have enough bidders.
Yeah, that seems to be the sense that I get as I've seen DOD leaders talk about this. Stacy Busjanik talked to me about it at TechNet Cyber this year in Baltimore a couple months back. Katie Arrington's been on the program before discussing this. Strikes me they've set a course of action. They're going to follow that course of action because they think it's the best course of action for the department. And if this vendor or that vendor doesn't like it, that's kind of too bad. Nobody said it in that way, but that's right. The vibe that I get.
Yes, and I think that's been a very consistent message from the beginning, I think, with them. I mean, I remember there was a meeting that Katie Arrington had with the Professional Services Council, I think it was about 6 years ago now, in Arlington, Virginia, and she started the meeting by talking about CMMC and what they're planning to do and how they're planning to roll it out. And her message then was, if you don't want to come along and protect the information we're trusting you with, we're not really interested in doing business with you anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been a very consistent message from them from the beginning.
All right. It's great to talk to you as always. Thank you for your insight, my friend.
Wonderful to be here as always, Francis. Thank you.
You can read more about the final rule on CMMC on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The Fed Gov Today podcast is back on Tuesday. To make sure you don't miss it, follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. And you can listen on demand at fedgovtoday.com anytime. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for listening.